Welcome to the Tim Allman Podcast. It's a beautiful day to be alive. We are in the Easter season. The tomb is empty. You're not finding the body. Jesus is arisen and ascended and reigning one, and he's quick to return. And until that day comes, I pray that we're working toward unity and love and care, that the fruit of the Spirit would be seen in our homes, in our churches, in our church bodies, wherever Jesus happens to find you. Today, I get to hang out with a brother in the gospel that I've admired from afar. His name is Dr. Mark Blanke. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He recently retired from full-time ministry at Concordia University, Nebraska. Go Bulldogs, after serving as a faculty member and a DCE program director for 30 years. I love that, Mark. Prior to that, Mark served at Concordia River Forest, now Concordia Chicago, and as a parish DCE and principal at congregations in California. He graduated from Concordia, Nebraska with a BS in education and a DCE certification. He received 2 masters, one in counseling and guidance, another in parish education, and then a doctorate, and this is where we're going to kind of focus some of our time today, a doctorate in adult education from Northern Illinois University. He's the founder and current director of the Institute for Religious Education, also known as IRE at Concordia. He's a husband, father, and a grandfather. To give you a general sense of where he's coming from, Mark thinks, and I'm going to let him speak for himself, that churches can and should, and this goes to every leader at every different level in our churches, we can grow in our understanding of raising up adult education environments where all of the baptized, the priesthood of all believers, are growing in what it means to know and follow Jesus. So how you doing, Mark? What a joy to be with you today, brother.
Doing well. Thank you for the invitation.
No, this is going to be fun. So before we get into a little bit of the survey, which is kind of going to be the major focus of our time together, how did your formation of DCEs, how did that evolve over 30 years at Concordia, Nebraska? There had to be some sort of an evolution with a rapid state of change. Tell that story just a little bit, Dr. Blanke.
Yeah, first of all, it was such a blessing to work with the students that I've had to work with. I mean, DCs are a unique group in that they're practitioners, but they also are people that like to get into the theory and focus on that to some degree. And so I just had wonderful students to interact with. The evolution really became when I arrived, and even when I was at RF, there wasn't as much content, there wasn't as much available. I mean, I started in 1990, and there just hadn't been done as much research. There wasn't as much awareness of the practices, and so really the content, I bet you we added probably 9 classes to the program from the time that we first started. So I did my master's in parish education from Concordia, Nebraska, while I was still in the parish, and much of that content that was used in my master's level coursework is now contained in the undergraduate coursework, just because it's relevant to all DCEs. So it's been an evolution. Unfortunately, it's DCs are always second chair leaders, and they follow the lead of the senior pastors. And one of the things that's become quite evident, or was evident to start with, has become more so, is that really the capacity the DCs have to implement change is very strongly influenced by what the senior pastor is determined is a priority or not. So that hasn't changed. I think that more and more senior pastors are comfortable working with the DC and somebody else that's an expert in a certain field, but at the same time, the DC has to wait for that insight to be provided about what's some clarity about where we're going. And so a lot of my focus has been, there's 560, 580 DCEs in our synod, but there's a lot more pastors, and there's a lot of congregations that don't have the capacity or the resources to have a DCE, or there's not enough DCs to go around either. And so we really have to make an effort to influence pastors to some regard about the issue of education, because many of them will never work with the DCE.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. What are some of the classes that you ended up adding over the years to help DCEs lead as second chair leaders?
Yeah, for example, there wasn't a required confirmation course on confirmation development and design. There was useful. The adult ed course wasn't an undergraduate requirement. Leadership development, enabling others to lead and teach, is a course that wasn't an undergraduate requirement. There were a couple of other field experience courses that we put into place as a component of the DC preparation to get them out connecting with the field more. When I went to school, the practicum experience was we did during what was at the time Jan term, which was a 5-week period. And we'd come back and go to a church for about 3 weeks of that, 5 weeks, and we changed that. It's been changed for a long time, but we do a year-long practicum experience, which is like the field work that pastors do. So,
Yep.
so they get to see the development within a congregation for the entire year, and then they also do a year-long internship that we do. When I went through, the internship could be as short as 16 weeks and as long as a year, and now it's a year requirement. So much more intense in terms of the content.
I love it. How many, last question here, and then we'll get into the survey. You've seen the spectrum over 30 years of maybe larger DCE kind of cohorts at Concordia, Nebraska, and probably some leaner years as well. Could you give us like the range of how many
Yeah.
DCEs were in the program?
Yeah. Well, one time we had, I think our peak was we had about 120 in the DC
Wow.
program.
What years roughly?
Kind of, well, I'm always bad on remembering the years. They all flow together. I think it was around your era,
My time,
basically.
oh two, oh
Yeah.
three, oh four, kind of in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And uh, when, we saw a decline in church work programs across the board. DC has slid. I think when I retired, we had about 50 in the program. So that's a significant decline. But that our decline was not as bad as, for example, what Lutheran teachers had uh, declined, as well as the other programs, and we're talking across the Synod. And so the work of the Set Apart to Serve folks have really made an effort to try and amp things up a bit. Um, but what's been interesting is that the demand has stayed high, but we've seen a higher level of retention in the parish for people that stay DC ministry for a long time. We've seen a retreat of guys with extended experience as DCs in the parish, because many of those are going SMP route. So actually, probably 5-6 years ago, there were actually, for the first time, more female DCs than there were males,
Hmm.
because of the attrition that to go to SMP, and that stayed pretty much the same. The females now outnumber the guys, um, but um, but there's longevity, right? There's people that have been at it for many years, and quite a few folks that, and now we're up into the hundreds of people that have retired as DCEs, stayed their whole
Man,
career as DCEs. So that's been neat to watch.
no question. All right, let's get into it. Tell the origin story of the adult education survey. How did that come about, Mark?
Yeah, the IRE, the Institute for Religious Education, or the IRE, is doing a 3-year project on adult education, and that was prompted. It's been kind of a journey to get to where we're at with this. So back in, I think, 95, Search Institute did a study that was called Effective Christian Education. Seminal study. It studied 12,000 people from 6 different denominations. At the time, it cost over $2 million to do, and so very few people do the kind of research anymore. But um, they found that the quality of Christian education, not just did you have something going on, but the way it was done, had a significant influence on faith formation, or what they called faith maturity. They had indicators of faith maturity. And so they found that there was a really strong relationship between the quality of Christian education and growth in faith maturity, as well as congregational and denominational loyalties. So they did it of youth and of adults, and kind of the common factor was that the effective Christian education was one of the most significant factors that contributed to faith maturity. The Synod then did a study. It's called Congregations at Crossroads. I think it was around 2000, and they did this study, and it was asking the same questions. It still talked about faith maturity, and it said, what are we doing? How are the parishes doing in the LCMS? Uses some of the same researchers from Search Institute to do it. I think Lou Jander was the guy in St. Louis at the time, great guy that kind of made sure that this happened. It found the same thing, right? The correlations were the same. And it also found that basically in the Synod, we're doing poorly. It's an area that they said we could focus on, that our education tended to be leader centric, a lot of lecture, not a lot of interaction. In other words, while there was education happening at almost all Lutheran congregations, it wasn't being done well. It wasn't done effectively. And the correlation between faith maturity and education was not whether it was happening, it was whether it was being done well. And so we knew back in 2000 that most churches in our synod were not doing it well. And so then the IRE did a study in 2005, State of Christian Education in the LCMS. We kind of wanted to get a baseline for where things were at, and we found that about a quarter of the congregations had any written goals for their educational ministries, which is one of the characteristics of effective education.
Sure.
We also found that pastors reported that they spent about a quarter of their time on education, either teaching it, preparing others, doing their own preparation, everything involved with education. So pastors were devoting a great deal of their energy, as self-reported, towards Christian education. But in general, for example, pastors rated their own adult educational program on a scale of 1 to 10 at about a 6. And it was one of the higher ratings of how they rated different programs. Their youth ministry and junior high, they rated the lowest. They also felt like our effectiveness in Christian education was declining within the LCMS. That led to the IRE did another study back in 2016. It was called Christian Education Practices and Congregational Characteristics. And by the way, Tim, these are all available on the IRE website. So cone.edu/IRE will get you to this. So you can look at any of these studies. So in this study in 2016, we said we didn't set up, here's what a healthy congregation is, but we asked congregations to self-identify themselves. These are primarily pastors that are responding as were they healthy or not healthy. And so of the congregations that identified themselves as healthy, some of the characteristics they exhibited were lack of conflict. They were growing. There was adult participation rates were good, and that there was also giving and things that we'd often kind of generally associate with being healthy. And what we found, there are these 8 best practices in Christian education, and so we said, okay, do you consider yourself healthy? The ones that had these characteristics. Then we said, how many of you are doing these best practices? And 7 of the 8 best practices correlated very highly with whether they were defined themselves as healthy. In other words, whether they were growing, they had lack of conflict, things along those. So those practices did indeed correlate with general health in the congregations. So that led us to go, okay, this is there's been some research by Ted Kober, Built on a Rock. He does some stuff about relation to that and conflict of involvement in education. Tom Rayner has done a lot of stuff for the Baptist Church and relative to even retention and effect and involvement in Christian education and it being well done. So this is, plus we're commanded by God, right, to be in study of his word. I don't want to leave that to last, but Martin Luther elevated the importance of catechesis in the process. But the fact that we're not doing it well, and the fact that in my view, Tim, I think that this issue is the most important issue relative to discipleship formation in the church. And it's the thing that we can invest the least amount of effort into to make great strides. So that's what prompted the 24 study and the adult education project.
Well, I got a couple questions. When you say we can make the least amount of investment and see the greatest gains, what do you mean by that specifically, Mark?
I mean that one of our concerns that we've come upon is that everybody feels that they're at saturation point, that their capacity is nil for some new program or something like that. What I'm saying is that if someone, pastor or anybody, is teaching anyway, he makes changes to his procedures, which doesn't involve a lot of extra time, and he improves what he's doing, and it has more effective impact. One simple example is the statement of goals and objectives, which is common in all education everywhere. So imagine that you're doing a class on Revelation, and you've got that promoted, in the bulletin or on the screen, and it says, "Hey, come to the class on Revelation." Just add a outcome. Just write
Yeah.
what the hope for outcome is. Explain that to people. I mean, we're not talking about, hey, you're going to have to really spend inordinate amount of time to get this thing in place. Now, to get things so that they're operating like a well-oiled machine, yeah, you're talking about a long window of a lot of little steps, but you can make slight improvements without really investing a great deal more time. You just do it according to certain standards, is basically what
I
you
love
need
it.
to do.
So start with a goal. What are those 8 best practices? Can you walk through
Yeah,
those just really
yeah,
quick?
yeah, sure.
People are probably
The
interested.
the first one is student centeredness, that the teaching methods and the methods of designing the course content needs to have a student centered component. Their teacher training is a high priority, because once you get these criteria of what's good and what's not good, you want to convey that to other people. You want to have participation expectations. Now, this is again an easy one to lead to. Are the members hearing from their leadership and the pastors, and they're hearing from the pulpit that, hey, we would expect you to be involved in some education? I mean,
Yeah.
you can do it on your own. You can do it online if you find some good resources, but we want you to be doing that. Another one is pastoral support. Again, not a high resource depleter. Does the pastor support what's going on? Um, Program evaluations, which is one of the places that we miss quite frequently in our churches, is that, do you know whether learning is taking place? Do you know where your aiming is hitting the mark? Are there any type of evaluations? Goals and structure is a big component. So are there written goals, and is there intentional structure? One of the simple structure pieces, Tim, that I always am surprised this is lacking, is that there's oftentimes there's not even a tracking of who's going to educational experiences and who isn't. So
Wow.
that's a structural piece, right? Do we have an idea of what our participation levels are like? And then two others that had a little bit less impact overall, at least in some of the other studies, including the effective Christian education studies, are intergenerational opportunities, and also service project opportunities.
Mm.
So I think that's 8. I had them written
Yeah, it
down
is.
yeah.
Oh,
So
that's great. Go ahead.
yeah, you can see by some of those that they're not all these big audacious things that are really going to take a lot of time.
Yeah, I mean, establish some intention. I'm drawn to not knowing who our students are.
Right. Yeah.
That I mean, that's a simple start. I don't care what size of a church you are. If you're not tracking with some sort of we use Planning Center, or we've used Church Community Builder. Do we know who are in our groups? And are we encouraging pastor, leader, teacher, whoever it is, to invite people to check in? Like, we start out with worship, we got a connect card, and this isn't because Big Brother's watching or something like that.
No, no.
We actually want to know you're here, so we can connect you to your right next steps as you grow as a Jesus follower. And so as a congregation, we've got kind of an onboarding into membership. And then once you're in membership, here's what discipleship looks like. We want you to be in the Word, and we've got a number of different classes, CG Cares classes, or small group experiences where our leaders are very well trained for adult education conversations. Now, this is I want to highlight this lecture-based teaching versus Aristotelian question-based instruction. There's a lot of research that says adult education theory, the Aristotelian question-based model, does lead for the greatest interaction, and I've seen this in spades. I lead a weekly, it's not just leader, but kind of up and coming leaders here at Christ Greenfield could end up doing a whole host of things. We meet at 6 a.m. on Sunday, and there's between 8 and 12 people who show up, and
Right.
we're walking through a book of some sort. Could be growing as emotional healthy leaders, and then we're spending time in the Word of God. And I spend about 15 minutes in preparation. I could spend more, but I 15 minutes is focused on 4 or 5 questions, right? Strategic
Right.
questions that we want to make sure. And then when I don't show up, that's how the conversation goes. A quote is read, a question is asked, and then we all kind of, digest the material together. Say more though about the difference between lecture and the Aristotelian question-based approach for adult education, Mark.
Yeah, in adult ed, well, there was a adult ed theorist back in the early '70s, Paulo Freire, and he tended to be, well, he didn't tend to be more socialist in nature, but liberation theology. He was kind of involved down in Latin America and stuff. But he called the current method the banking method, which was, there's a really smart leader who knows a whole bunch of stuff, and he's going to convey a little bit of that, deposit it in certain learners who will then have the opportunity to deposit in other people. Now, Freire was concerned about that because he saw it as a power relation, power dynamic and stuff.
Sure.
But it does kind of encapsulate what we often think of when we think of even higher ed, right? That we're going to get these really intelligent people, and they're going to, deposit a little bit in these students who might grow, but they'll deposit a little bit later on. And I just don't think that replicates Christ's teaching style. I think that there is a method that encourages effective questioning and the use of those skills, and going places where the teacher may not have intended to go, because student-centeredness means you have to take some account into what are the students, how do they interpret this, and what do they value. And I'm not talking about everyone just kind of pulling their ignorance. I mean, there's direction in the whole thing. And as you probably know by this point, asking effective questions is extremely difficult. I mean,
Yeah,
there's
it is.
different levels of questioning, but it's much easier to lecture. And I think that's why many of us fall back to that model. But it has less impact. And think about any learner who works with this has to think and say, when is my antenna really up and I really learn and move forward my understanding? Is it when I listen, or it's when I talk about something? And everybody reflects on their own experience, and they know that when I've made a commitment some way, by making a statement in some way, that's when my antenna are just hyper ready to learn things. When I'm able to sit back and relax and take in stuff and multi-process elsewhere, I'm just not there as much, right? So the small group models are not just small group but it's because it encourages more interaction and talking. So those methods work well. And I think that it's important for many of us. I know a problem that I often had as a faculty member is I had to cover certain content.
Right.
And so I would want to get through this stuff because we're going over chapter 4 today. So let's talk chapter 4. And that's the goal of learning, is not for me to go over stuff. It's for people to retain information, to have them understand things. So you need to retreat back a little bit. And the only way to do that is to get the feedback going back and forth and seeing, where are my learners? What are they finding as a key interest point? And how can I build on that based on the content, what I know, or what others in the class know? And that's more of a student-centered or learner-centered approach.
In what way has Western higher ed maybe put a filter over our eyes as we look at the teaching style of Jesus and how discipleship? I know that's a deeper question, but I'm sure you've contemplated it. I mean, for me, it's hyper individualism and really a higher center on content, kind of a brain on the stick. You open up the brain and then you put in content, and maybe a disregard for growing together as less of a regard, maybe not a disregard, but less of a regard for growing together as a faith community, a faith family, and dealing with not only our content, but our character and the emotions of the leader, maintaining the love and humility of the leader. A community can kind of keep that in line, but I think our hyper individualism in the West has I guess disrupted and I use this term very generally, the organic nature of discipleship. That in the going, right? This is a great commission. On your going, wherever it is in your various vocations, we're going to talk and we're going to live the way of Jesus. We're going to speak the words of Jesus. Say more there, Mark.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite adult ed stories of Christ's teaching was with the rich young ruler, right? What must I do to be saved? And so in that instance, the young ruler comes in with the question. And so they pose, this is my need right now.
Yeah.
And Christ, in giving him the answer, poses more questions. What does the scripture say? And also Christ doesn't give the right answer. I mean, because he says, do these things and then you will be saved. And, he doesn't give the answer. And then the rich young ruler leaves, and we don't know what he decided or what came of it. But here's where adult education comes in. What Christ does is he uses that model, this is that doing thing, and he uses that to talk to the disciples then. So I don't know who the target audience is of that learning experience, right? Was it the rich young ruler, or was it the disciples to say, it's harder for a rich man to get into heaven than a camel through the eye of it. And so we've got this picture of Christ going, let me show you what you're going to be dealing with. He sends out the 70 and he goes, hey, let's come back and talk about this. And, we know that the disciples, even after the crucifixion, didn't have the whole picture of things. They were not the most literate regarding what was happening, what their faith was. So I've got to believe that the 70 that were sent out were even less competent. But he said, go out and do stuff, and then let's come back and talk about it. Hey, what happened? How'd it go? And let's debrief that. We kind of have and this is a westernized view of things, right? We kind of want everybody to be at this level, and then maybe we'll get them into a real back and forth when they understand all of the nuances of the confessions. I don't think that's the disciple model that Christ set up. I don't think that fits that model. I always think it interesting that he would say his parables, and then people would generally leave, and then disciples would say, well, what was that all about? I got to believe that the people that walked away didn't know either about a lot of it, but it would pose questions. There's a theorist called Jack Mezirow who talks about perspective transformation, and Mezirow will often talk about how to initiate this perspective transformation, and you start with a disorienting dilemma, something that makes you go, oh, that's that doesn't align with what I've been thinking or how things work, and that launches one into a deliberate learning process. I think that oftentimes the lecture model and the instructor model is all very comfortable, very relaxing. We take in what we choose to take in, but seldom are we challenged to go, oh, this is going against what I'm used to operating like. So I may have gone a different direction there.
No.
Okay.
I think it's very helpful. Have you paid attention to Jordan Peterson and kind of his lecture circuit today?
I do
at all?
Watch him frequently on
Sure.
Facebook posts and things like that.
I think it's fascinating. A lot of younger people are showing up to his lectures, but his lectures are in the form of a question, and he's walking through logically a path, and he doesn't exactly know. I mean, he knows he's a very bright man, but he doesn't exactly know how the question is going to be answered at the end. And what he's doing is, this isn't a lecture where he's, reading some notes on a page. He's modeling logical progression toward an unrealized end, and the pursuit of that is in line with some sort of an adventure as a story kind of unfolds that leads him to that place. It's a different type of lecture that then leads, I think great rhetoric. I don't care if it's a 10-minute, 20-minute, hour and a half long lecture. It leads people to ask more questions, to discover the truth. And ultimately, Jesus led with a lot of different questions and led them to discover, praise be to God, that Jesus was the way, the truth, and the life. But Jesus's approach was much more, and I think Dr. Peterson is hitting on something here, much more storied, much more curious, much more adventuresome than it was dictatorial. This is the way. Like, the best professors I ever had were adventurous, curious discoverers, right? I mean, they were actually moving, and they were inviting me into, think of Dr. Meal. He was my Hebrew professor. Like, that guy led with so many questions. I learned to love Hebrew, great, but I left interacting with a man that obviously was in love with Jesus and was in love with learning and wanted to invite his students into it as well. There's a different spirit in an educator and it's the difference between humility and pride, isn't it? Who comes in and invites you in through questions, and you recognize, wow, this person has deeply thought about these things. I
Yeah.
obviously have a lot to learn, but they're leading with questions rather than answers, and they're inviting you into story rather than dictating a certain type of story. Anything more to say there about the power of story, Dr.
No,
Blanke?
I think that what you're talking about is the story, but you're also talking about the journey of observing the journey, right? And being a
Yeah, that's
part of
right.
that
That's it. The discovery
process.
process.
Right. And I think that's what Peterson does. You kind of, when he's talking, for example, you don't know where is this going to land exactly. I mean, where are we going to get to? And uh, my sense is that the reason he's so tractional for many people is that when they finish that learning experience, I mean, even though it's not traditional, when they finish that learning experience, they're really asking a lot more questions about that topic than they were when they came in. And I
Yep.
think that the traditional learning style, the Western style, is you may have questions. I hope they line up with mine because I'm going to tell you the answers to those.
Yeah.
And if they don't line up, whatever, this is what I'm going to cover. And so that's teacher centric versus being student centric. And one of the characteristics of effective education is that it's student centered. So
Yeah.
the story, the journey, being a part of that with the leader, that's what's a joy.
Amen. Isn't this why the early church exploded cross culturally? Because they
I,
had to lead with questions and curiosity rather than dictation. It wasn't going to work. They somehow, by the Spirit's power, that's how,
yeah.
learned the way of Jesus to show hospitality and love, to be culturally, contextually sensitive, but then look for hooks to ask the right questions that would open up the exploration of who is this one named Jesus? What did he come to do? Who is this? And could this be the promised Messiah? I mean, all these types of questions that move beyond Jewish boundaries into
Right.
Gentile waters. Anything more to say about how the explosion of the early church in the book of Acts and beyond was led from a place of curiosity rather than condemnation and dictation, Dr. Blanke?
Yeah, I think that I haven't done a lot of research on the history. I'm more concerned with, how are we doing with education today? But
Yeah, fair.
But I think that even historically, back in first century Palestine, there was a there was a it was a collaborative journey. I mean, there was a lot of things that were happening at the temple that were at the synagogue that were standardized educational format, but so much of it became this mentorship when you'd adopt following a certain rabbi and making those connections. And it was a journey. It was always seen as a journey. We I think oftentimes we see a class now in our churches as the completion of something. We're going to get through this content. And I think that a better model is to say, this is a component of the content that will lead you further in your ongoing journey, which isn't going to end, right? It's an ongoing piece. And we both know that the gospel makes no sense. I mean, that's one of the attractivenesses of the Christian faith, is that if it were designed by human beings, it wouldn't look like this.
That's
it
right.
wouldn't be a merciful God who's done everything in order to save us and we do nothing. That doesn't make sense according to human reason. So
Yeah,
just
right.
posing the gospel makes people ask, what is this? What does this mean? And how does this work? And I think that is often missed when we go into a formalized lecture type of a top-down format.
So, what is evaluation? If you could
Yeah.
paint the picture of like what is one way that you've got a class that you're teaching or you're evaluating. A number of our churches may have some small groups. What are some evaluative tools that are really, really helpful to help
Yeah.
whatever the teaching is to grow, just get better? Go ahead.
Yeah, the easy piece, first, and I always say easy stuff, and I'm saying that, Tim, because one of the things that I'm trying to figure out, I'm doing like a consultative role with the Nebraska district on adult education, and I go to Winkles and we talk about adult education, and I find that the pastors are very receptive to this content. I mean, they get it, and they understand it. There's not a us and them thing. There's not a you
Good.
put me down. Um, but there tends not to be a follow-up piece to make changes. And again, I think it goes to our capacity and what we can do and what we can't do, because there's not there's not a rejection of the concepts, right? But so when I say easy, I always want to make it so that listeners say, okay, yeah, we're not talking about some doctoral dissertation on something like this. But an easy evaluation, for example, is if you're able to state what the outcome is for the class. Okay, we're going to talk about whatever the content is, stewardship. Okay.
Sure.
And you say at the beginning of the class, my goal or the objective is at the end of this class, you're going to be able to do this and this and this. You're going to either know this, feel this, or do this better. Okay. And then at the end of the class, you say, okay, this is, again, I'm making it the easiest level, but you would say, okay, we just finished this piece on what the outcomes are. Tell me how we did. How many of you feel like we're doing this better? And you just do a thumbs up, thumbs down. I don't know, see where people are at. The teacher then gets the feedback loop of going, okay, of this content point. In fact, I just did this. I was speaking to some administrators in the district, and at the end, I said at the beginning what my outcomes were. At the end, I had 3 outcomes. 2 of them, yep, 1 of them, So I know here's what I didn't convey well, what I didn't do well. You can do pre and post tests for people if you've got a long series. What do you know currently about sanctification? And then we finish this. What do you now know about sanctification? And this does 2 things. One, it allows the instructor to know, wow, the content was covered adequately. But learners, we talk about how do we get more people in study. Learners are motivated by a sense of progression. So if they do a pre-test and a post-test, and the results can be hit, it can be anonymous. But if they look at it and go, son of a gun, I've moved from here to here, that's motivational for further participation. And then we get into larger evaluations. We can talk about what your overall outcome is, and for all of your educational ministries, and that happens really at the administrative level. So,
wow, I don't know that there are many churches, and this is the next step, I think, of learning for us. You got me, because no field I've done that on sermon series and teaching, and that's kind of more embedded. But I'd be curious to do a pre and post test for a respective sermon series or for a respective CG Cares class or whatever Christ Greenfield class that we offer. I don't know that's. Have you seen some churches that have baked that into their system, Mark? That's unique to me. I love it.
I know DCEs who have done it, right? They just choose to do it. And it's a pre and post thing. Usually members recoil at it at the beginning because one of the barriers to participation is tests, right?
Right.
So you have to articulate to them, no, this is giving you just a general view and helping me out. But the first thing somebody has to do before they do a pre and post test is they've got to have some outcomes, right? And so I think one of the biggest lifts here, Tim, and this is a piece that I often get positive feedback from, but people don't know exactly how to do it, is I believe that pastoral leadership in a congregation has to identify what the characteristics are of a maturing Christian or maturing disciple, and they've got to articulate that to their members. If the leadership of the church does not have a picture, an understanding, an outline, a target of what they're aiming at, what are you evaluating? So in fact, the IRE is working on a resource that will allow congregational leadership to work together to go through some scripture to say, what do we want to identify as the characteristics of a maturing disciple at this church? And we're not going to say these are the ones you should have. I mean, they may say it's the fruits of the Spirit or whatever it is. And then there will be an assessment instrument that the whole church can do, and the leadership can look at it and go, okay, we're doing pretty well in this regard, but we're not doing well in these other 2 things that we think are important. Let's put that into our content. And then you do that assessment 3 years later and you say, have we moved the needle at all in this area? So that's kind of the ultimate picture of what the adult ed project will lead to.
I've heard pastors say you can't evaluate sanctification. Don't even try. This is the Spirit's work. You're going to be moving into works righteousness waters, legalistic waters. What do you say to them, Mark?
I just don't think that's scriptural. I get it. And one of the things that we have troubles with oftentimes is differentiating preaching from teaching, right? They're 2 different exercises. And the Bible uses, Paul talks about go forth preaching and teaching. Well, if they're the same thing, why would he have used different words? And the Greek is different form, right? And so teaching does have outcomes. Yep. I mean, that's in every other teaching venue, there are outcomes that are stated. And I just don't see how one can say, well, it's not, you can't measure that. Yeah, it's different than preaching. Preaching is proclamation of the word and how the Spirit uses that. But there are better ways to preach and not preach. I think also, although I've never taken a homiletics class, um, but when we're talking about teaching, I mean, Paul talks about, the immature being fed milk and then the meat.
Right.
And Luther talks about development moving along on the spectrum, and what things to focus on, what things not to focus on, and when to use certain language and how to appeal to the learner. I just don't think it's I get it, but I don't know if it's one of those things that we really have to be quite as worried about as we tend to be. And when does worry, is worry not the issue, but perhaps releasing us from responsibility is more of the issue.
Yes, I agree. So we can talk about
Oops,
looking.
sorry.
No. We can talk about looking more and more like Jesus. I think one of the handles that we talk about is we're going to proclaim the work of Christ. That is the gospel, the life, death, resurrection, ascension of Jesus for you, the broken, hurting sinner. We're going to use the words of Jesus to do so. He is the way, the truth, and the life. And all of our life is oriented around the words of Christ. But then that will inevitably, by the Spirit's power, lead us to the way of Jesus, that the humility of Christ, the love of Christ. The Apostle Paul starts out almost all of his letters with an increase of faith and hope and love and joy, right? That this would increase more and more as you grow up into Christ, who is the head. And in our LCMS, we're not shying away from preaching the third function of the law, third use of the law.
Right.
You don't get to say how the law kind of lands when we preach the law, but nonetheless, many people will say, "Oh, look at this," and I think you need the Spirit, you need the body of Christ. I remember when you used to become anxious in this situation,
right?
And I can highlight this with a staff member, right? When this just sets you off, but now I see increased peace and patience with yourself and with others. That's leading us together. We're more healthy together as the body of Christ because of that. So I agree with you. I just had to kind of poke the bear a little bit.
But I'm glad that
Mark.
you use some examples, Tim, that when I get objections to this measurement piece, it's a lot of times around the affective domain or the feel domain, right? But we want people to be attracted to worship. Well, what is that? That's a feel component, right? Yeah. And so there are those affective components that that I think if there's anxiety about legalism, it can really start to get entwined with that whole piece. But that's those are things that we would have expectations for a believer, a maturing disciple. So,
hey, Mark, this has been a fun conversation, brother. I could keep going, but I'm at time. If people want to connect with you, how can they do so?
Yeah, my email is Mark with a K .Blanke. It's BLANKE @CUNE.edu. That's the best way to get to me. And then also to go to the CUNE website, www.cune.edu/IRE. And you can find there's 6 resources. And in fact, the survey, the summary results of this 2024 survey is up there for you to read also if you want to get that more information about what's going on in the Synod.
Hey, this has been awesome. You're a gift to the body of Christ, Mark. I'm better for spending this hour with you. And this is the Tim Allman podcast. And just a little shout out for everyone starting to follow on YouTube and just get the word out. We want to have really healthy, sometimes are more challenging conversations, but Jesus shapes us in and through challenging conversations, asking big questions for the sake of advancing the gospel. That is our heart here at the Unite Leadership Collective, and we're proud to be members first of the kingdom of God through the waters of baptism, brought into a right relationship with Jesus, and we're also in our conversations and our working congregations also grateful to be members of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. This is the Tim Allman podcast. Please comment, like, subscribe. I hope this leads to a lot of great conversation, not just online, but face-to-face in your congregation as you look to identify women and men with a desire by the Spirit's power to grow up into Jesus, who is the head, and for us to have just a few more systems and structures for us to be lovingly held accountable in discipling those baptized people very, very well. That's been the outcome of this conversation today, Mark, and I'm grateful for you and praying for your continued work. It's a good day. Go and make it a great day. Thank you so much, Dr. Blanke.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks for the invitation. Blessings on your work.
Thank you.